What happens when a decorated war hero gets pulled over by a cop who thinks he's above the law? You won't believe how she turned the tables. It was a quiet Wednesday night in Toledo, Ohio, the kind where the city seemed to hold its breath. The streets were mostly empty, lit only by the dull glow of scattered street lamps and the occasional passing car. Most folks were home by now, tucking into bed or watching the late news. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't most folks. She was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, and after wrapping up a long strategy meeting at a military base 2 hours south, she was finally headed home. Her black government-issued SUV hummed gently as it moved through the streets. The vehicle wasn't flashy, just a clean, well-maintained model with lightly tinted windows. It matched Jasmine's personality, composed, efficient, and unassuming. Inside, she sat tall behind the wheel, her posture perfect even though fatigue was creeping in. Her mind wasn't on the road so much as it was on the soft bed waiting for her and the warm tea she planned to sip before turning in. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't distracted. She was simply driving home, focused and steady. But someone else had their eyes on her vehicle. Parked near Reynolds Road, Officer Clarence Thomas was bored. His shift had dragged on with no action, no real calls, just the humdrum quiet that made the hours crawl. He sipped on his lukewarm coffee and scrolled through his phone, already dreaming about ending his shift. That's when Jasmine's SUV rolled by. It wasn't weaving, it wasn't speeding. It was just different, unfamiliar, and in Clarence's mind, unfamiliar meant suspicious. He tossed the paper coffee cup aside, flicked on his cruiser's lights, and started following her. Jasmine noticed the flashing lights behind her in the rearview mirror. Her instincts sharpened immediately, not out of fear, but out of training. She eased her car to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and waited. She wasn't panicked, she'd done nothing wrong, but experience had taught her that being right doesn't always protect you. Clarence stepped out of his cruiser with authority in every stride. His hand rested near his holster, the other gripping a flashlight. He didn't walk around to the passenger side. He went straight to her window. There was no greeting, no courtesy, just a sharp command. License and registration. Jasmine, keeping her hands visible as protocol dictated, rolled her window halfway down and responded calmly, "Officer, may I ask why I was stopped?" Clarence flicked the flashlight in her face, searching for something that wasn't there. "You were drifting between lanes. Didn't signal. Looked like you might have been drinking." Jasmine's brows furrowed slightly, her voice still even. "I haven't been drinking." "License and registration," he repeated, louder this time, as if volume could replace reason. She didn't argue. With slow, deliberate movements, she opened the glove compartment and retrieved her documents. As she handed them over, she added, "This is a government vehicle. I'm a federal employee." Clarence looked at her ID and smirked. "Military?" he asked with a dismissive tone. "Doesn't mean you're above the law." Jasmine kept her voice level. "I never said I was." But Clarence was already on edge, or perhaps on a power trip. His tone turned colder. "Step out of the vehicle." Jasmine blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said, step out of the car. I'm conducting a sobriety test." Her jaw tightened. She wasn't confrontational, but she wasn't submissive either. "On what grounds?" she asked. "I've cooperated. I haven't been drinking." "I'd like to know the reason." Clarence took a step closer, now raising his voice. "Now you're refusing a lawful order?" Jasmine remained composed. "I'm asking for an explanation." That only seemed to escalate things further. He yanked the car door open himself. "Get out of the car, now!" That's when Jasmine quietly picked up her phone, unlocked it, and pressed record. She held it up slightly and said, "Just so we're clear, this conversation is being recorded." For the first time, something flickered across Clarence's face, a hesitation, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Out, now!" Jasmine stepped out. She stood tall, calm, her every movement controlled by years of training and discipline. Even in civilian clothes, her presence was unmistakable. She didn't yell. She didn't resist. But her dignity was unwavering. Clarence studied her for a moment, maybe finally registering that she wasn't just another civilian, but his ego pushed forward. He made her walk a straight line under the flickering street lamp as if she was some drunk on a Saturday night. She did it flawlessly, no sway, no stumble, no hesitation. Then came the breath test. She passed. 0 alcohol. Still, Clarence scribbled a citation. "Failure to stay in your lane," he muttered. Jasmine took the paper silently. No argument, just a long, deliberate look before she got back into her vehicle and drove away. She didn't rush, she didn't cry, but her mind was already processing what had just happened. What Clarence Thomas didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that he had just written a ticket to someone who wouldn't let it slide. Jasmine Crockett wasn't going to file this under annoying but forgettable, because for her, this wasn't just about one unfair stop, it was about a system, a pattern. A lifetime of quiet, calm, dignified women being spoken over, doubted, and dismissed by men with just enough power and far too much ego. What he didn't realize was that the story didn't end on that dark stretch of road. For Jasmine, it was only the beginning. And when the dust settled, it wouldn't be a traffic citation on the record, it would be a lesson, a reckoning, not just for him, but for every officer who ever believed the badge gave them permission to forget their duty, to serve with respect. Back at the station, Clarence Thomas logged the traffic stop like it was nothing. He typed up the citation report with practiced efficiency, selected the drop-down for possible impairment, marked no arrest, and uploaded the file. His body camera footage was tossed into the charger like it was any other night. No second thoughts, no notes added. To him, this was routine. A driver he believed acted defiant, one who dared to question his authority, had been put back in her place. In the break room the next morning, Clarence leaned against the vending machine, coffee in hand, and recounted the incident like it was a punchline. "Some woman tried to flash a government badge at me last night," he told Officer Lena Whitmore. "Thought that'd stop me. Guess she figured being military meant she didn't have to answer questions." Lena, usually quiet during Clarence's rants, froze mid-sip. "Military?" she asked. "Yeah," Clarence answered casually, waving it off. "Some Jasmine Crockett or whatever. Gave me this attitude, acted like I was the one out of line." Lena frowned, setting her cup down. "Wait. Jasmine Crockett?" Her voice dropped a note. "Lieutenant Colonel Jasmine Crockett." Clarence raised an eyebrow but shrugged. "That ring a bell?" Lena gave a slow nod. "She's no ordinary officer. She spoke at the academy last year, runs logistics at Fort Whitmore. Bronze Star, 2 tours, she's legit. High ranking, respected." Clarence scoffed. "So what? On the road, I don't care if you're the president. If you act sketchy, I stop you." But something about Lena's reaction stuck in his mind. It wasn't fear. It was respect. It was the kind of quiet shift in tone that made you realize maybe, just maybe, You had misjudged someone. Still, Clarence didn't bother checking the footage, didn't review the interaction. In his mind, he had followed protocol. The ticket was issued, the night was quiet, and the shift moved on. He expected the incident to vanish into the stack of routine reports. But back at Fort Whitmore, Jasmine Crockett was sitting in her office, sleep-deprived and unsettled. Not because she had been rattled, she had faced far worse, but because the incident had left a bitter, familiar taste. It was not just about her. It was about every young soldier she had mentored over the years, every junior officer she had reminded to stay composed, every civilian she had seen treated unfairly because they didn't hold a title or a badge. Most of all, it was about the moments she herself had let slide for the sake of peace. This time, she wasn't going to let it slide. Jasmine sat alone, watching the recording from her phone on a loop. The officer's tone, the way his hand hovered near his holster, the way he demanded compliance without offering reason. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't resisted, yet he treated her like a threat. Her aide, Sergeant Daniel Whitmore, knocked softly on the door. "You good, Mum?" he asked. Jasmine looked up. Her eyes were steady but weary. "No," she answered quietly, "but I'm handling it." He hesitated, then stepped inside and closed the door. "I saw the video," he said. "Do you want me to get the base lawyer involved?" Jasmine nodded. "Already done." Daniel paused, shifting his weight slightly. "Are you sure you want to go public with this?" Jasmine leaned back in her chair and exhaled. "I'm not looking for drama. I'm looking for accountability." That line sat in the air between them, sharp and clear. She had never used her rank for leverage. She believed in the integrity of the system she had served her whole adult life, but integrity did not mean silence in the face of injustice. It meant using the tools she had earned through sweat and sacrifice to push for better. Her rank was not a shield. It was a responsibility. She picked up her phone and began making calls. Military Legal Counsel, the Inspector General. She submitted her report. Attached the video, wrote down every detail. She wasn't angry for herself. She was angry for the system that still allowed men like Clarence Thomas to operate unchecked. She knew this wasn't about one ticket or one bad officer. It was about a culture where asking a question could be seen as defiance, where calmly stating your rights was treated as insubordination. And it had to stop. By the end of the week, the wheels were in motion. Clarence's name appeared in an internal review notice. Legal teams from both the Department of Justice and Fort Whitmore were quietly made aware. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued her duties as if nothing had happened. She showed up on time, ran logistics for disaster drills, checked reports, trained new recruits, but behind that composed exterior, she was preparing. Her lawyer, Rebecca Nolan, called one afternoon and confirmed what Jasmine already suspected. "There's a case here," she said, "more than just internal discipline. He may have broken federal rules during the stop." Jasmine didn't hesitate. "Then we go to court," she said firmly. She wasn't seeking fame. She didn't want headlines. She wanted a ruling, something concrete that proved what happened to her wasn't just inappropriate, it was wrong. Clarence Thomas had treated her like she was nobody because, in that moment, he didn't see the uniform or the service or the dignity. He saw a woman who didn't obey quickly enough. And that, more than anything, was what Jasmine Crockett was determined to confront. Not just for herself, But for everyone who had ever been told their calm wasn't calm enough, their questions were too much, and their dignity didn't count. Clarence Thomas still believed this would all blow over. He went about his next shifts like nothing had happened, telling himself he had done his job and followed the rules. But the first sign that things were shifting came in the form of a plain manila envelope left on the front seat of his cruiser. His name was typed neatly on the front, no return address, no frills. He ripped it open as he stood in the parking lot outside the station, expecting it to be another department memo or shift schedule. Instead, it was a court summons. Civil rights complaint. Plaintiff, Lieutenant Colonel Jasmine Crockett, charges unlawful detainment, intimidation, abuse of power. Clarence stared at the document, frozen for a moment. He muttered to himself, trying to dismiss the weight of it. "No way this holds," he said aloud. "She wasn't even arrested." He shoved the paper back into the folder and walked inside, trying to wear his usual swagger. But as he stepped through the station doors, he sensed it. The air had changed. His commanding officer, Chief Howard Sloan, called him into his office. The blinds were closed. The door clicked shut behind them. Clarence slumped into the chair, arms folded. "What's this about?" he asked, already on the defensive. Howard sat down slowly, steepling his fingers together. "That woman you stopped last week," he said. "She's not just filing a complaint. She's suing. And she's not just anybody, Clarence." Clarence leaned back, scoffing. "So what?" "She's acting like the victim. I didn't even touch her." "She's not pretending," Howard replied. "Do you even know who she is?" "I don't care who she is," Clarence snapped. "She got stopped, acted rude, and now she's upset I didn't roll out the red carpet." But Howard's face remained stern. "She's a lieutenant colonel, war veteran, Bronze Star. She has a spotless record and powerful allies, and she recorded the whole thing." "From her angle? And yours?" Clarence shrugged, trying to hold on to the last scraps of his usual defiance. "So we're apologizing now because she outranks me?" "No," Howard said firmly. "We're not apologizing. But we're not ignoring this either. You're going to court, and this won't stay quiet. Once this hits the news this department will be in the spotlight." Still, Clarence resisted. She wasn't harmed. There were no threats. "I didn't raise my voice until she got snippy. I did what I was trained to do." "Did you?" Howard asked quietly. "Because from what I've seen, you escalated. You treated her like a threat before you had any reason to. You didn't de-escalate. You didn't show any judgment." Clarence clenched his jaw, but said nothing. "The trial is in 3 weeks," Howard continued. "I suggest you start preparing. The department will provide counsel, but if this goes sideways, don't expect much cover." Clarence left the office, feeling the weight of reality starting to press against him. In the locker room, he noticed the looks. Conversations stopped when he entered. People cleared their throats, avoided eye contact. He wasn't the tough guy anymore. He was the problem, and that scared him more than he would admit. Back at Fort Whitmore, Jasmine Crockett prepared too, but differently. She didn't call a press conference. She didn't post online. She met quietly with her attorney, Rebecca Nolan, and reviewed every frame of the video footage. Again and again they watched it. Clarence's tone, his posture. The way his hand hovered near his weapon, even though Jasmine never once raised her voice. She wrote down every detail, time stamps, body language, exact wording. She wasn't doing it for revenge. She was doing it because it mattered. Rebecca sat across from her, flipping through legal papers. "Are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this?" she asked. "It's public. It'll follow you." Jasmine nodded. "Good," she replied without hesitation. Rebecca studied her face. Most people would have dropped it, taken the apology or the internal review, and let it die quietly. Jasmine looked back at her with steady eyes. "I've ignored too much already." She wasn't after money. She wasn't looking for apologies. What she wanted was something official. A ruling that said no, this wasn't okay. A public acknowledgement that a uniform and a badge do not entitle someone to disrespect, to intimidation, to unchecked power. She had worn her own uniform for over 2 decades. She had followed rules, earned trust, led missions, and now she wanted the system to acknowledge that she had rights just like anyone else. When the court date was confirmed, she didn't hide. She requested to wear her full dress uniform to the trial, not to intimidate, not to boast, but to make sure the jury and everyone else watching understood exactly who she was and what she represented. On the day of the hearing, she stepped into the courthouse without fanfare, her uniform crisp, medals aligned, posture straight. She wasn't just Jasmine Crockett. She was every woman who had ever been dismissed for being too calm, every soldier who had ever been pulled over for looking out of place, every American who believed that respect should not be conditional. Clarence Thomas was already seated at the defendant's table when she entered. He turned, saw the uniform, and for the first time, the arrogance on his face faded just slightly. But the real reckoning hadn't even begun. "No ban jan san sang, ming se trien kai tiep fan, e4 nhe." The morning of the trial arrived with a grey sky hanging over Toledo, as if the weather itself understood the gravity of the moment. Jasmine Crockett stood in front of her mirror, smoothing out the creases in her full dress uniform. Each pin, each medal, and each stripe told a story, earned through service, sacrifice, and leadership. She didn't wear it to impress the courtroom. She wore it so that when people looked at her, they would see not just a woman who was pulled over, but a soldier who had spent over 2 decades serving her country with discipline and honor. This wasn't just a traffic case. It was a moment that would define what kind of behavior society would tolerate from those sworn to protect and serve. As Jasmine entered the courthouse, her heels clicked confidently against the marble floor. The courtroom was already half full. There were no reporters yet, but plenty of officers from both the local police department and Fort Whitmore. Some sat in uniform, others in civilian clothes. Jasmine didn't look around. She kept her eyes forward, walking with quiet purpose. At the defense table, Clarence Thomas sat with his lawyer, Noah Bennett. He glanced up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted. The familiar swagger was gone. In its place was tension, barely masked by a forced stillness. He saw the uniform. He saw the woman he had dismissed, now framed by the symbols of command and respect. And for the first time since that night, he looked unsure. Judge Logan Bennett entered promptly at 9. After opening remarks and procedural formalities, Jasmine was called to the stand. She moved with calm control, her back straight, her chin level. When she reached the witness box, she adjusted her collar once, then folded her hands in her lap. The judge nodded. "Lieutenant Colonel Crockett, thank you for your service. You may begin." Her attorney, Rebecca Nolan, rose from her seat and approached with a quiet authority. "Lieutenant Colonel," she began, "could you walk the court through what happened on the night of January 17th? Jasmine's voice was steady and clear. I was driving home from a military planning meeting around 11:15 at night. I had been on the road for nearly 2 hours. I was not speeding, swerving, or doing anything erratic. I was tired, but alert. At some point, I noticed police lights behind me, so I pulled over immediately and waited. Rebecca asked, "What happened next?" Jasmine continued, "An officer approached my window. He didn't identify himself by name. He asked for my license and registration. I asked respectfully why I was being stopped. He told me I was drifting and might be impaired. I had not been drinking, nor was I impaired. He then asked me to exit the vehicle for a sobriety test. When I asked for clarification, he repeated the order louder. At that point, I began recording on my phone. I complied fully, passed the test, and was issued a citation for failure to stay in my lane." Rebecca nodded. "Did you resist at any point?" "No." "Did you raise your voice, act aggressively, or attempt to leave?" "No." "Did you identify yourself as a federal employee?" "Yes. I stated that I was driving a government-issued vehicle and that I was a federal officer." The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that felt like a held breath. Rebecca stepped aside. "No further questions for now." Then it was Noah Bennett's turn. He rose from his seat with a practiced calm, as if trying to project professionalism and control. "Lieutenant Colonel Crockett," he began, "is it possible Officer Thomas was just doing his job?" Jasmine didn't blink. "If doing his job includes escalating a stop with no threat, then perhaps. But in my experience, professionalism includes communication and judgment. Could he have been concerned about your safety or the safety of others? That would imply there was a risk. I was neither erratic nor intoxicated. There was no cause for concern. And yet, you recorded the interaction. Why?" "Because I've learned that in situations like this, silence doesn't protect you. Evidence does." Bennett paused for effect. "You don't believe officers should use their own discretion?" Jasmine looked directly at him. "I believe discretion should always come with self-control. A badge is not a pass to intimidate. It's a promise to serve responsibly." Even the judge leaned back slightly, absorbing her words. Then it was time for the video evidence. First, the court played Jasmine's phone recording. Her calm voice, the respectful questions, and the way she stated her credentials were all crystal clear. Then came Clarence's body cam footage. It showed the same story, but from a different angle, his quick movements, the hand lingering near the holster, the tone of command without explanation. Watching it, the courtroom saw how easily power can turn from protection to pressure. The contrast between her calm and his force was undeniable. When Clarence was asked to take the stand, he refused. His attorney said his statement had already been submitted. But the prosecutor pressed on. "Sergeant Thomas, why did you order her out of the car?" Clarence's jaw tightened. "She seemed suspicious." "Did she disobey you?" "She questioned me." "Is that against the law?" "No." "Did she yell or threaten you?" "No." "Then why escalate?" There was no immediate answer. "Did you know she was a lieutenant colonel?" "Not at the time." "Would that have changed how you handled the situation?" Clarence's voice dropped slightly. "Probably." That word echoed in the courtroom, not quite an apology, but it was an admission. And for the first time, everyone in the room saw what Jasmine had seen that night, not just an overzealous officer, but a system where perceived authority outweighed mutual respect. The day's session ended quietly. Jasmine stepped down from the stand and returned to her seat. Her face remained composed, but her message had landed The uniform had done its part, but it was her words, her presence, and her truth that carried the most weight. And as the courtroom emptied, there was no applause, no fanfare, just the silent acknowledgement that something important had been said. And even more importantly, it had been heard. 3 days later, the courthouse was noticeably quieter. The buzz that had filled the air on the first day of the trial had settled into a thick, tense calm. Reporters had started trickling in, not in droves, but just enough to remind everyone that the story was no longer private. It had entered the public record. And as the jury prepared to return its verdict, those watching understood that what had begun as a routine traffic stop had evolved into something much larger. This was no longer just about a ticket or even an individual officer. It was about the responsibility of power and the value of dignity in the face of intimidation. Jasmine Crockett sat at the front of the courtroom, composed and quiet. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, but today she wore no medals. She wanted the jury to see her not just as a soldier, but as a person. Her presence carried weight, not because of what she wore, but because of how she had carried herself through the trial. Across the room, Clarence Thomas sat beside his attorney, Noah Bennett. His face was pale, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The confidence he once wore like a badge had faded under the scrutiny of video evidence and public testimony. He no longer looked like the man who had pulled someone over with a smirk and a flashlight. He looked like someone waiting to learn if his actions would finally catch up to him. Judge Logan Bennett entered the courtroom and signaled for everyone to rise. The jury filed in, their expressions serious, measured. No one looked at Jasmine. No one looked at Clarence. They kept their eyes forward, as if to remind themselves and everyone else that their role was to judge the facts, not the people. The courtroom held its breath as the foreperson stood. Judge Bennett nodded. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. "In the case of Crockett versus Thomas, we find in favor of the plaintiff." There was no gasp, no outburst, just silence, heavy and complete. Clarence shifted in his seat. His attorney leaned over and whispered something, but he didn't respond. Jasmine didn't move either. Her face remained neutral. Not stoic out of pride, but calm. Because this moment was never about vengeance. It was about validation. Judge Bennett continued. "The court finds that Sergeant Clarence Thomas violated the constitutional rights of Lieutenant Colonel Jasmine Crockett during an unlawful stop. His actions did not follow department protocol or basic professional standards." He paused for a beat before continuing. "There will be no criminal charges at this time. However, the plaintiff is awarded $35,000 in civil damages. This ruling will be entered into the public record and forwarded to the Department of Justice and the Toledo Police Department for policy review." Clarence's mouth tightened. His lawyer mumbled, "We'll appeal." But even that sounded hollow. The judge stood, dismissing the court. As people began to rise and shuffle their papers, Jasmine remained seated for a moment longer. She bowed her head briefly, not to anyone in the room, but to herself. Then she stood and walked out with the same steady grace she had shown since day one. Outside, a few local reporters waited by the steps, cameras raised. Clarence exited first, lowering his head, shielding his face with the same manila folder that once held the summons. He didn't answer questions. He didn't look back. He simply got into his car and drove away. Inside, Jasmine checked her phone. A single message from Rebecca Nolan read, "You won. Case closed. She gave a soft nod. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about proving someone wrong. It was about sending a message, loud enough for others to hear. Behind her, Rebecca caught up. "You could have asked for more," the attorney said. Jasmine smiled faintly. It was never about the cash. Rebecca studied her. "Do you think this will change anything?" Jasmine turned toward the glass courthouse doors. "Maybe. Maybe next time he stops someone, he'll hesitate." A week later, the department placed Clarence on suspension, pending a full review. There was talk of reassignment, others of early retirement, and some murmured that his career was effectively over. The man who once walked the station halls with authority now drew glances of quiet judgment. Not because people suddenly hated him, but because he had exposed something uncomfortable. That a badge without humility is dangerous. That authority without accountability is a threat. He had become a symbol of what could go wrong when ego outruns judgment. Back at Fort Whitmore, Jasmine returned to her daily routines. She gave no interviews, declined every media request, and made no social media posts. She didn't want to be turned into a headline or a hashtag. She had missions to coordinate, soldiers to train, and logistics to oversee. But among those who served with her, the impact was deeply felt. In whispered conversations between recruits, in the quiet respect of colleagues, in the certainty that they were led by someone who had stood firm when it would have been easier to stay silent. For Jasmine Crockett, the courtroom had never been a battlefield. It was a classroom, a place to remind others, and maybe even herself, that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it stands still. Sometimes it records. Sometimes it just tells the truth and lets the truth do the work. And in doing so, she had proven a deeper truth to every young soldier watching from the sidelines, that power means nothing without purpose, and rank means little if it's not used to protect those without it. After the verdict was read and the courtroom emptied, Jasmine Crockett didn't allow herself to linger in the glow of victory. There were no celebratory dinners, no social media posts, no interviews on courthouse steps. She returned to Fort Whitmore as if the past weeks had been just another chapter in her long, disciplined career. But beneath her composed exterior, a quiet storm had settled, not of regret or resentment, but of reflection, because even though the case was over, she knew the work wasn't. Holding someone accountable was never just about a legal outcome. It was about what came next. For the first few days after the ruling, Jasmine kept a low profile, sticking to routine, morning briefings, logistics updates, scheduling disaster relief drills. But word of the court case spread quickly through the base, especially among the junior officers and fresh recruits. They spoke of it quietly, mostly in the dining hall or during downtime. Some admired her courage. Others were just stunned that someone of her rank had gone through something so blatantly unjust. Jasmine didn't feed the conversation. She believed leadership meant knowing when to speak and when to observe. But change was already happening, even if it wasn't loud. There were small but significant shifts in how the younger soldiers carried themselves, especially around authority. They asked more questions. They spoke with a little more care and listened a little more closely. And perhaps most notably, they looked at Jasmine with a different kind of respect, not just for her title, but for what she had stood up against and how she had done it. One afternoon, during a leadership meeting, her aide, Sergeant Daniel Whitmore, lingered behind after the others had left. He looked at her with the seriousness of someone who had seen the ripple effect up close. "Ma'am," he said carefully, I think people are looking at command a little differently now, in a good way. Jasmine glanced up from her notes, one eyebrow raised. Differently how? Daniel shrugged. Like maybe it's not just about orders and protocol anymore. Maybe it's about how we carry ourselves when no one's watching. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she closed her folder and looked out the window. The late afternoon sun was spilling across the training field, where a group of young soldiers were lining up for drills. That's what it's supposed to be, she said softly. Leadership with integrity. That's the standard. In private, Jasmine continued to correspond with Rebecca Nolan. Her lawyer had become more than just legal counsel during the process. She was now someone Jasmine trusted for perspective. Rebecca had been monitoring the response from the Toledo Police Department since the ruling. They had initiated a policy review, quietly but sincerely. According to internal sources, they were reassessing de-escalation training and the use of discretion during traffic stops. No press releases, no grand gestures. But behind closed doors, Clarence Thomas's actions had triggered something the department could no longer ignore. Jasmine read Rebecca's updates without gloating. She wasn't interested in a headline that read, "Reform sparked by lawsuit." What mattered to her was whether the next person, whether they wore a uniform or not, would be treated with more respect than she had been. Whether officers like Clarence would think twice before acting on impulse instead of judgment. Whether silence would no longer feel like the only safe option. Then, 2 weeks after the trial, Jasmine received an invitation. It came from the base commander himself, requesting that she speak at the next orientation for new recruits. The theme, he noted, was leadership under pressure. At first, Jasmine hesitated. She was not someone who relished the spotlight. She led through action, not speeches, but she also understood the power of storytelling, especially when it came from someone who had lived it, so she agreed. On the day of the orientation, Jasmine walked into the auditorium wearing her standard uniform, no medals, just the basics. The room was filled with fresh faces, new recruits who had only recently taken the oath. Some looked nervous, others eager, but all of them were paying attention. She stood at the front without notes, scanning the rows before she spoke. How many of you believe that wearing this uniform automatically earns you respect? A few hands went up, tentative and unsure. Jasmine gave a small nod. I understand why you'd think that. It feels powerful, doesn't it? The rank, the title, the history behind this cloth. She paused. But here's the truth. Respect isn't something you're given because of a patch on your chest. It's something you earn every day with your actions, your choices, and your character. She let that settle before continuing. I had an officer stop me once. He didn't know who I was. He didn't care. What he saw was someone he thought he could intimidate. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just recorded what happened. I reported it. I took it to court. And I told the truth. The room was silent, not because of boredom, but because every person in it felt the weight of her words. That officer believed his badge made him invincible, until he saw my rank not just the one on my collar, but the one I carried in how I stood my ground. That's the kind of leadership I want you to carry. Quiet, steady, accountable. She didn't speak for long. Jasmine knew the best lessons weren't long-winded, they were lived, and hers had been. As she stepped off the stage, a young woman in the back row sat up straighter. A young man near the front gave a small nod. Those were the signs she looked for. Not applause, not praise, just recognition. The kind that says, I heard you, and I'll remember. Weeks passed. Life at Fort Whitmore returned to its usual rhythm, filled with drills, paperwork, training sessions, and mission briefs. But even amid the routines, there was a subtle shift in the air. The courtroom battle had ended, but its echo remained. Not loud, not disruptive, just present, like a quiet reminder that some lines should never be crossed again. Jasmine Crockett had moved on, at least outwardly. She remained punctual, composed, and focused on her duties. But there were moments, in the silence of her office or during her early morning runs, when she replayed everything. Not with regret, but with purpose. Because she understood now more than ever that justice wasn't a destination. It was a discipline. A standard that had to be protected again and again. Clarence Thomas, meanwhile, was no longer patrolling the streets. After the department's internal review, he was placed on indefinite suspension pending a reassignment decision. Rumors swirled. Some said he would be moved to desk duty. Others whispered that he might retire early under pressure. But what was clear to everyone, including Clarence himself, was that his influence had been broken. The badge still hung on his locker, but it no longer carried the same weight. He didn't walk the halls with the same clipped confidence. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms, not out of respect, but discomfort. Colleagues who had once defended his methods now kept their distance, not out of betrayal, but because the illusion had been shattered. People had seen the footage. They had heard the testimony. And they could no longer pretend he was just doing his job. One afternoon, Clarence found himself alone in the locker room. The benches were empty, the usual chatter absent. He sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. A file folder rested on the bench beside him, his reassignment notice. He hadn't opened it yet. He didn't want to, not because he feared a demotion, but because he feared what it symbolized. That somewhere along the way, he had stopped being a protector and started acting like a gatekeeper, that his instincts had become walls instead of bridges. He reached for the folder, opened it slowly, and read the new assignment: Community Relations Liaison. It felt like punishment, dressed in purpose. But maybe that's what he needed. Back at the base, Jasmine received an unexpected invitation. It wasn't military. It came from a local community college that had recently launched a public ethics series. The director asked if she would be willing to speak about leadership, accountability, and public service. At first, she hesitated. It wasn't her usual setting, but after reading the request twice, she said yes. A few days later, she stood in a modest auditorium, speaking not to soldiers, but to students, faculty, and community members, some in uniforms, others in jeans and t-shirts. Her words were the same, but her audience was different. She spoke of her experience not just as an officer, but as a citizen, as a woman, as someone who had chosen the harder road for the right reason. The crowd listened, not because of her rank, but because her message was clear. Power is not a privilege. It is a responsibility. After the event, an older man approached her. He wore a faded veteran's cap and walked with a cane. He introduced himself as Leonard, a retired police chief. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "Not just for your service, but for reminding folks that courage doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it's in how you carry yourself when no one's clapping." Jasmine offered a small smile. "Sometimes that's the only time it counts," she replied. They shook hands, and Leonard nodded once before turning to leave. Meanwhile, within the Toledo Police Department, new training modules were being quietly introduced. Officers were now required to attend de-escalation seminars and implicit bias workshops. No one admitted these changes were directly tied to Clarence's case, but everyone knew. And though some grumbled, most understood that the shift was overdue. It was no longer enough to assume good intentions. The standard had to be higher. The community deserved better. At Fort Whitmore, Jasmine resumed her schedule, but something in her presence had changed. She still moved with discipline and spoke with precision, but her silence now carried more weight than most speeches. Recruits watched her more closely. Seasoned officers deferred to her judgment with greater care. And when difficult conversations arose, people didn't avoid her. They turned to her, because Jasmine Crockett had not just stood her ground in a courtroom, she had drawn a line in the cultural sand and dared others to follow it. One morning, as she reviewed logistics for a humanitarian supply drop, a young recruit named Isla Crockett, no relation, just a coincidence, approached her with hesitation. "Ma'am," she began, "I just wanted to say what you did. It meant something, not just to us here, but to my family. My brother's been through things, and it's hard to explain how much it matters to see someone like you speak up." Jasmine paused, then stood. "Thank you for telling me that. But remember, courage doesn't belong to the few. It belongs to anyone who's willing to carry it." Isla nodded, visibly moved. Later that day, Jasmine sat alone in her office, staring out the window at the base yard. She didn't need applause. She didn't want medals for this. What she wanted was momentum, because she knew there would always be another Clarence Thomas. Another situation where someone thought silence was safety and arrogance was strength. But she also knew that the more people who stood their ground, the less room there would be for abuse to thrive. The weeks after the courtroom decision turned into months. Life, as it often does, moved forward. But for Jasmine Crockett, something had changed, not just in the policies or the perception of power, but deep within herself. She had always been a leader who believed in quiet strength, who led from example rather than volume. But the experience had shifted her view of what leadership looked like when the stakes weren't on a battlefield, but in a hallway, on a street, or during a routine interaction that went wrong. It was no longer enough to lead her unit or to represent integrity within the military. Jasmine had come to realize that her presence carried weight far beyond the base gates. Whether she liked it or not, people were watching. And not just to see what she would do, but to understand what was possible when someone refused to be silenced. It was a cold Thursday morning when she received a formal request from the Department of Defense to attend a roundtable on civil-military relations. The topic was the role of military leadership in shaping public expectations around justice, equity, and service. Jasmine reviewed the agenda carefully. This wasn't a photo op or a public relations meeting. It was real policy discussion. She agreed to attend. A week later, she sat at a long oak table, surrounded by other officers, policy analysts, legal experts, and community advocates. The energy in the room was cautious, but curious. Jasmine wasn't the most senior person there, but when she spoke, the room quieted. She recounted what had happened, not in dramatic detail, but in clear, measured terms. She emphasized the danger of normalized authority abuse and the weight of inaction. "There's a difference between order and obedience," she said, "and when institutions prioritize control over understanding, we lose trust. Not just in the systems, but in ourselves." One of the civilian panelists, a professor from Georgetown, leaned forward. "Do you believe what happened to you was about race, gender, or power?" Jasmine answered, without hesitation. Yes, it was about all three. But more than that, it was about conditioning. We've allowed certain behaviors to go unchecked for so long that we stop noticing them. Until someone records it, until someone files a complaint, and by then, the damage is done. We need to change what we allow in the grey areas, not just what we punish in the black and white. Her words resonated. After the session, several attendees approached her privately to thank her not for the speech, but for the clarity. That clarity followed her back to Fort Whitmore, where she returned not with a new title or rank, but with a new sense of urgency. She called a meeting with the training division. Her message was simple. The culture needed reinforcement, not with stricter rules, but with better conversations. So she helped launch a new leadership module focused on ethical decision-making under pressure. It wasn't mandatory, but every session filled up. One afternoon, she walked past the training center and paused at the open door of a classroom. Inside, a young instructor was guiding a group of soldiers through a case study. On the whiteboard was a scenario that mirrored her own experience, an officer stopping someone without cause, and the response that followed. Jasmine didn't step inside or announce herself. She just listened. The recruits were engaged, thoughtful, and respectful. They weren't just memorizing regulations, they were learning how to think beyond them. That moment filled her with quiet pride. The kind that didn't require applause, just progress. Meanwhile, Clarence Thomas had begun his reassignment at the department's Community Outreach Division. The change had been met with mixed feelings. Some believed it was a slap on the wrist. Others saw it as a chance for growth. Clarence himself didn't speak much about the transition, but those who worked alongside him noticed something different. He listened more. He spoke with less edge. He no longer walked into rooms like he owned them. He still had a long way to go, but the man who had once barked orders behind a flashlight now stood in front of high school students talking about the cost of mistakes. He didn't tell them everything, but he told them enough that he had made assumptions. That he had paid a price, and that if he could go back, he would have handled it differently. For some, that mattered. Back on base, Jasmine found herself spending more time with younger officers. She invited them to speak candidly during mentoring sessions. They talked about pressure, about fear of speaking up, about the discomfort of challenging toxic culture when it came from within. Jasmine didn't preach. She listened, and when she did speak, it was with the voice of someone who had already walked the road they were just beginning to see. Silence, she told them, is the easiest path. But it's also the one with the deepest consequences. If you can speak safely, constructively, and with purpose, then do it. Not just for yourself, but for the ones who can't. That message didn't stay confined to those sessions. It began to ripple outward, pass through conversations, embedded in the way decisions were made. Recruits who once feared drawing attention now felt encouraged to ask questions. Officers who once avoided tough topics now stayed behind after meetings to talk about them. The culture was still rigid, still deeply shaped by rank and tradition, but it was bending slightly, steadily, towards something more humane. For Jasmine, that was enough for now. She didn't need monuments or medals for what she had done. What she needed was to know that in the quiet spaces where choices are made without cameras or courtrooms, someone would remember. That an officer would take a breath instead of barking an order. That a recruit would hold the line, not because they were told to, but because it was right. That was leadership. Not given, not inherited, but lived. The day of the final review hearing arrived quietly. There were no cameras, no reporters, no public statements. Just a small conference room inside the Toledo Police Department headquarters, a panel of 3 senior officials, a representative from the Department of Justice, and Clarence Thomas seated on the opposite side of the table. He wore a plain suit, no badge, no uniform. Only a subdued demeanor that spoke of weeks spent grappling with consequences. The internal affairs officer opened the meeting with formalities, but the tone was already clear. This was not about whether Clarence had broken a rule. That had been settled in court. This was about what came next. Clarence listened as they reviewed the findings. They discussed the body cam footage, the court's verdict, and the statements from community members who had been watching closely. Then they asked him one question. "Sergeant Thomas, in your own words, what did you learn from this?" He took a moment before responding. "I learned that being right in your own eyes isn't the same as doing right by others. I learned that the uniform doesn't shield you from accountability, and I learned that when someone asks you a fair question, you better have more than authority behind your answer. You better have respect." There was a long pause. Then, the lead investigator nodded slowly. "We appreciate your honesty." The panel concluded with a decision that had been anticipated but not guaranteed. Clarence would not return to street patrol. Instead, he would remain in community relations for the duration of his service. No promotions, no leadership roles. His record would reflect the disciplinary action permanently. It wasn't a firing, but it was a statement. The department would be restructuring its oversight protocols. New de-escalation training would be required, and all officers would complete annual bias awareness modules, beginning immediately. Meanwhile, at Fort Whitmore, Jasmine Crockett sat across from Rebecca Nolan at a small corner table in the base cafe. It was a rare moment of quiet between logistics briefings and readiness drills. Rebecca had just returned from the DOJ hearing and came with updates. "They're implementing the reforms," she said. "Clarence is officially off the field. Training changes are in motion. It's not everything, but it's movement." Jasmine stirred her tea, then looked up. "That's more than I expected," she said. Rebecca gave a slight smile. "You didn't just change a verdict, you changed a process." "That matters?" Jasmine nodded, but she wasn't smiling. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "why it takes so much to get people to see what's been there all along?" Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out the window toward the training field where young recruits were jogging in formation under a pale sky. "Because comfort is loud," she finally said, "and change is quiet, until someone decides not to stay quiet anymore." Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. Later that afternoon, Jasmine walked through the base with her usual purpose. Along the way, she passed Isla Crockett, the young recruit who had spoken to her weeks earlier. Isla was standing with a few other recruits, mid-conversation, but when she saw Jasmine, she straightened and offered a quick salute. Jasmine returned it with a slight nod and kept walking. Moments like that reminded her why she had chosen to stay in service all these years. Not for the ribbons, not for the rank, but for the quiet, steady impact that leadership leaves behind. Back in her office, Jasmine opened her inbox and saw an email marked urgent. It was from the Joint Military Ethics Board, asking if she would participate in a panel focused on building trust between military institutions and civilian communities. The title of the panel was simple: The duty to listen. Jasmine read it twice, then hit reply. I'll be there. That night, she walked the perimeter of the base like she often did when she needed to think. The air was crisp, the stars were clear, and her thoughts were calm. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't carrying the weight of frustration, she was carrying direction. She thought of Clarence. Not with bitterness, but with realism. He had made a choice that night, and so had she. But while his was shaped by reflex and ego, hers had been shaped by restraint and principle. And in the end, it wasn't just the law that had made the difference. It was the choice to stand firm when silence might have been easier. The choice to carry dignity even when it was ignored. And the choice to demand better, not just for herself, but for everyone who came after. The next morning, during a weekly meeting with her senior officers, Jasmine shared a short briefing. It was direct and clear. Going forward, we will be reviewing all training procedures related to civilian interaction. I want every officer on this base to understand that respect is not a courtesy. It's a requirement. That's the standard, and we will hold each other to it. There were no objections, no resistance. Just the quiet sound of people taking notes and nodding. As the meeting ended and officers filed out, one of the newer lieutenants stayed behind. He looked hesitant, almost nervous. "Ma'am," he said, "I just wanted to say thanks for showing us how to do this right. A lot of us, we watch, even when we don't say anything. We watch how you move." Jasmine looked at him for a moment, then said, "Then let's give them something worth watching." 2 months later, Jasmine Crockett stood in front of a room filled with fresh recruits. It was orientation week at Fort Whitmore, and she had been invited to close the final day of training with a personal message. The lights were dimmed, the air still, the seats packed with wide-eyed young soldiers wearing crisp uniforms and expectation on their faces. Some were barely out of high school. Others had left college or jobs to join the ranks. All of them had come seeking something bigger than themselves. Jasmine stood without notes. She never needed them. She had long ago learned that the most powerful truths are the ones that live inside you. She looked out over the group, pausing before she spoke. "Let me ask you something," she began. "How many of you believe that putting on this uniform means you've earned people's respect?" A few hands went up, some confidently, some cautiously. Jasmine nodded, then lowered her gaze slightly. "I used to think that too. I thought if I trained hard, followed orders, showed discipline, and carried myself with honor, the world would respond in kind. That respect would come automatically." She looked back up, but it doesn't. The room was silent now. No fidgeting, no side conversations, just attention. Jasmine continued, "One night, I was driving home after a long day of duty. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't swerving. I wasn't breaking any law. But I was pulled over by someone who saw none of that. He didn't see my years of service. He didn't see my rank. He didn't see my discipline or my record. He saw a woman. A woman who didn't obey quickly enough. And because of that, he tried to make me feel small. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. That night could have gone very differently. I stayed calm. I recorded the interaction. I took it to court, and I told the truth. She let the weight of her words settle before continuing. The courtroom saw the video. They saw the way I was treated, and they saw how I responded, and they ruled in my favor. But it was never about winning. It was about what happens when you know who you are, and you refuse to let anyone else define it for you. A recruit in the second row leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. Another clutched her notebook a little tighter. Jasmine could feel them leaning in, not just physically, but emotionally. She gave them more. Leadership isn't about rank. It isn't about volume. It's about presence. It's about how you show up when things get hard, when someone pushes you, when they expect you to break. And it's about choosing integrity, even when no one's watching. She walked slowly to the left side of the stage. You'll wear this uniform in places where people will respect you. You'll wear it in places where people will fear you. And sometimes you'll wear it in places where people will ignore you entirely. She stopped. In every one of those places, you carry a choice: to be a servant or to be a symbol, to listen or to dominate, to escalate or to steady the room. Choose wisely. A pause, then one last message. When that officer pulled me over, he thought I was just another person he could intimidate. But what he didn't know was that my leadership wasn't stitched into my sleeves. It was built from every moment I had ever stayed silent when I could have shouted, every time I had chosen respect when I was disrespected. He thought his badge gave him power. But that night, he learned what real power looks like. It's calm. It's clear. And it doesn't flinch. She stepped back. The room remained still. Then slowly, a few recruits began to clap. Others followed. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't loud. But it was honest. And that's all Jasmine ever wanted. Afterward, as the recruits filed out, a young woman approached her. She was quiet, maybe 18, eyes sharp with curiosity. "Mom," she said, "thank you. I never knew someone could go through something like that and still stand up here with this much strength." Jasmine placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't always have to raise your voice to be heard. Sometimes, just standing your ground is enough." That evening, Jasmine returned to her office, the sun setting beyond the windows. She sat at her desk, took out her journal, and wrote one final note for herself. It wasn't a report, it wasn't a speech, just a truth. Power without responsibility is noise. Responsibility without courage is silence. Real leadership lives in the space between. She closed the book and leaned back. Outside, new recruits were finishing their drills, their cadence echoing in the cool evening air. The next generation had arrived. And this time, they were watching more closely than ever. Jasmine Crockett had not set out to change the system. She had only wanted to be treated fairly, but by refusing to back down, she had done more than win a case. She had started a conversation. She had shifted a culture. And most importantly, she had shown everyone, young or old, in uniform or out, that dignity is not something granted. It is something claimed, quietly, firmly, and without apology. In life, we often assume that titles, uniforms, or years of service automatically earn us respect. But true respect isn't granted by appearance, it's earned through character, patience, and how we respond when we're tested. Jasmine Crockett's story reminds us that dignity isn't about raising your voice, it's about standing firm when you're being challenged and choosing integrity when no one's applauding. For older Americans who've spent a lifetime witnessing change, this story reinforces something timeless: that real power comes not from control, but from calm. It teaches us that silence can be dangerous when it enables injustice, and that accountability is everyone's duty, whether we're in uniform, behind a desk, or sitting at a kitchen table. Jasmine didn't fight to prove she was right. She fought to remind us that no one, no matter how long they've worn a badge or held a position, is above decency. Her courage is a call to all of us to speak up when needed, to listen with humility, and to never confuse rank with righteousness. Because leadership, at any age, is not about commanding others. It's about being someone others want to follow.